Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another exciting lecture by Dr. Ronald Brown. Our topic for today is global migrations. Humanity is on the move. On the right, you see one of the more recent mass migrations of peoples. These were the Vietnamese refugees fleeing from the communist takeover of Vietnam and scattering around the world. Millions of people on the move, Vietnamese communities everywhere in the world. Well, this is a reality of our world. People are on the move. Well, in our outline, we are going to begin by talking about the great migrations of the past, because myself, I'm a product of a great migration when all the Europeans were flowing across the Atlantic Ocean and populating North America. So I am part of a great migration. So the past has been marked by great migrations for various reasons. More recently, we had the Second World War with not only the mass extermination of people, such as the Jews, but also the mass movement of people, rearranging borders, millions of people expelled from one country to the other. I was part of the Vietnamese War migration, working in Southeast Asia, experiencing what it was like to be a migrant or a refugee. Then mass migrations today. What's happening in the world today? We're experiencing a mass migration unlike ever in the past. It's a unique period. Point 5 is, how do different people respond to migrants? Very often they say, as soon as a migrant comes in the United States, they slam the door behind them, saying no more migrants. Well, people respond differently. And then finally, next stop, Mars. Get ready for the next big migration. If our planet continues to deteriorate, humans as a whole are going to be forced to flee our planet Earth and end up on Mars or Jupiter or some other exotic place. So let's get started with our program for today. Global migrations, humanity on the move. Well, humans began as migrants. We evolved from apes in Africa. On the right, you see me in Ethiopia, in Addis, and seeing this bones of Lucy, who lived some 50 to 70,000 years ago, walking upright, developing a modern brain. And as the populations grew, they started exploring down into the heart of Africa, through what is today Egypt, up into Europe, over into Asia, and then some 20,000 years ago, across from Asia to Alaska and down, peopling the Americas. So migration has been a part of the human experience from the very beginning. The great Indo-European migration, often called the Aryan migration, of some 4,000 years BC, or before the Common Era, somewhere up into what is today Ukraine and Russia. For some reason, a people started migrating. We don't know why. One of my old professors years ago said that there was a big hole up there, and at every couple thousand years it opens up and some new group of people emerges from this hole, whether it's the Aryans or the Germans or the Slavs Further east in Asia would have been the Huns and the Goths and the Visigoths and the Vandals, all these migrating people, which we call nomads, scattered around Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Well, the Asian branch of the Aryans became what are today the people of India, Pakistan, Iran. They went east. Another group of Aryans went west, and they became the Germans, the Swedes, the English, the French, the Italians, the Greeks, and ended up forming what we see on the right, the various Indo-European peoples. Romance were the Romanians, the Italians, the French, the Spanish. The Germans were the English, the Germans, the Dutch, the Danes, the Swedes, and the Norwegians, and the Icelanders. The Slavs were today the Russians, the Poles, the Yugoslavs, Bulgarians. Greeks were Indo-Europeans, and you can see over in the right, bottom right-hand corner, peoples of Persia, Iran, India, the Kurds in modern-day Iraq. These are all the Indo-Europeans, or commonly called the Aryans. And so it was a great migration that gave rise to what we consider the European peoples. If you look closely at the map on the right, you will see that there are some Europeans who are not Indo-Europeans. And these would be the Hungarians, which migrated much, much later from someplace in Central Asia, and their cousins, the people of Finland and the people of Estonia. Also, the people in the border between France and Spain, the Basques. Nobody knows where they came from, but they are not Indo-European. So migration has been part of the human experience ever since Lucy and her friends started migrating out of Africa, and then the great migrations of the Indo-Europeans and other peoples. The Semites came from someplace in Africa, probably North Africa somewhere. And as they migrated, they became the Canaanites, the Jews, the Phoenicians, the Arabs, the Ethiopians, and the Somalis. Another great migration, the Finno-Ugric people. The bottom on the left, you see that there are more people who speak Hungarian in Russia than there are in Hungary. You had the Native Americans in the top in the middle, leaving Asia, crossing over some 20 to 15,000 years ago and settling all of the Americas. A more recent great migration were the Mongols, coming out of what is today Mongolia, conquering China, Vietnam, Korea, Iran, Central Asia, even conquering Russia, destroying the capital of ancient Russia, the city of Kiev, and even marching in, waging war against what is today Germany, Hungary, and the rest of Europe. So migrations of people is part of our legacy as a human being. Well, many people attribute these great migrations to the rise and fall of empires. We had the great migrations of around the year 100 and 200, 300, 400s, when Germanic peoples, once again, came from we don't know where, the Goths, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, even destroying the Roman Empire, conquering Rome itself, and almost conquering the last bit of the Roman Empire, Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire. 3,000 years ago, the Chinese Empire was almost overthrown And that's why the Chinese built the Great Wall of China, to keep the barbarians from destroying the Chinese empire. Well, of course, the Mongols ended up crossing the mountains and destroying the empire anyways. But as we can see from the fall of the Roman Empire and the conquering of the Chinese empire by the Mongols, well, migrations are powerful and they can overthrow great empires. And as we're going to see, they can overthrow or seriously damage even the American empire. Donald Trump has good things to say about stopping migration, building his walls, keeping America great, or making America great again. The Great Muslim Migration, beginning in the 600s, where the Arabs came out of Mecca and Medina, conquered North Africa, conquered Spain, were defeated in France, but continued into India, up into Central Asia, to Turkey, the whole way over to India. So this was another great migration, spreading the Arabic language, spreading Islam around the world. On the right, we see the Islamic population today. Kazakhstan, up in what is formerly the Soviet Union, northern half of Africa, the Middle East, and over into Indonesia and India, Malaysia. The great Muslim migrations, building a great world empire. Another of the great migrations was the Atlantic slave trade, when Spain, Portugal, England, Holland, basically, started populating the Americas. Well, of course, many Spanish and Portuguese and Dutch and English went to the New World, but as laborers, they brought over an estimated 10 million slaves from Africa, one of the great forced migrations of history. When the Jewish kingdom in Palestine was overthrown and destroyed by the Romans, the Jews migrated around the world, beginning in 70 AD, forming Jewish communities all over Europe and eventually into the New World, and cities like New York, the largest Jewish city on the face of the earth. Once again, mass migration of Jews, which continues until today. Jews going to Israel, Jews leaving Israel, settling in Europe or America. The great Chinese diaspora. Diaspora is what we call people who don't live in their home country. We talk about the Jewish diaspora, Jews who do not live in Palestine, Israel, but live outside of their ancient homeland. Well, the Chinese have been migrating since time immemorial. In fact, large portions of the populations of the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Burma are Chinese. And today, every city in the world has its Chinatowns. So once again, migrations are with us until today. The great migration of Europeans, French to Louisiana, to Haiti, Spanish from California down to Argentina, the Portuguese to Africa and to Brazil, the English populating Canada, the United States, populating Australia, New Zealand, large numbers of British settling in Africa, South Africa today, large numbers of Dutch and English descendants. Russians expanding from their Russian homeland across Siberia, reaching the Pacific, and even sending populations to build towns and trading posts in distant Alaska. In fact, as I am speaking, the Russian population is trying to take over the Russian-speaking areas of the Ukraine, saying these are Russians, they're not Ukrainians, they speak Russian, they're Russian Orthodox, they should be part of Russia. And so mass migrations of Europeans beginning in 1492 and continued up until the 1960s. Well, two world wars also caused mass migrations. We know during the First World War, the Armenian genocide, when millions of Armenians were killed by the Turks. Following World War I, millions of Greeks were expelled from Turkey. Millions of Turks were expelled from Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece. Armenians were massacred and expelled. Huge transfer of population, millions of Turks from what is today Russia and the Balkan countries were expelled. A horrendous mass migration, and of course, forced migration with the deaths of probably millions of people as well. During World War II, the Holocaust, causing a mass migration of Jews from Europe to Palestine, to the United States, if they could get in, as well as to Cuba, to Argentina, and to Brazil. Another 6 million who couldn't get out were murdered by the Nazis. Here again, mass migration and extermination almost totally destroyed the Jewish population of Europe, but caused it to rise in other countries, those who were able to survive. Following World War II, you had the mass expulsion of French from Algeria. Millions of French and other Europeans who had settled in North Africa were expelled and fled. When the Jews took over Palestine, the mass killing and expulsion of Palestinians, transforming Palestine from a Muslim and Christian majority to a Jewish majority. When you look at the map on the right today, it's unbelievable that there are as many people living in those little green areas as there are in all of the rest of Palestine. The Jews are a minority in their own country, outnumbered by Christians and Muslims, but yet they hold on to power. Nelson Mandela, when finally South Africa got its independence and overthrew the white racist regime, many whites migrated to the United States, to Britain, to Australia, and to other countries. So following World War II, there was a mass migration, expulsion of peoples. One of the most horrendous was the partition of the Indian area into Pakistan, East and West. East Pakistan is today Bangladesh, India, Ceylon, and Burma, Nepal, and Bhutan. Here again, the idea was Muslims would go to the two parts of Pakistan, Buddhists would go to Burma and Ceylon, and Hindus would gather in what is today India. Well, 14 million people fled. Some 2 million were murdered by their respective countries. And this is only a few of the mass migrations caused by World War II. We had the mass expulsion of some 15 million Germans from areas that had been previously German, but they were handed over to Poland and Russia as war reparations. Millions were simply murdered rather than see them go to Germany. So World War II, establishment of new countries in Africa in 1960, led to mass migrations of people as well as horrendous genocides in places like Burundi and in Nigeria, where the countries tried to keep people within the borders of these new states, even if they wanted to achieve their own independence. Well, the migration experience that I lived through was the Vietnam War migration. Between 1955 and 75, some 2 million Vietnamese fled Vietnam. Many of them were fearful of the communist takeover and had good reason to fear the re-education camps or punishment. Many of my Vietnamese friends in the United States left with absolutely nothing on boats like you see at the bottom, in the middle. But large numbers of Vietnamese, especially those who were Catholics, ended up in France, for example. Other Vietnamese were admitted to Australia, to South America, to Australia and New Zealand. Well, they were fleeing first the war, and then they were fleeing the communists. This was America's longest war. United States and the Soviet Union and China were at war over who was going to control Vietnam. The world powers compromised where North Korea would remain puppet of Russia and South Korea would be occupied by the United States and a puppet regime set up. The same thing was going on in Vietnam, except that the North Vietnamese were not going to let the Americans or the French take over South Vietnam. And so the war drug on for almost 25 years. The boat people fled Vietnam. If you look at the map on the right, on the left, you see Vietnam. Well, South China Sea has lots of little islands. If you look south of the word Vietnam, you see Natuna. That's where I was based when I was working for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in '79, when some 800,000 boat people fled Vietnam. So there you get, well, I got a real experience of what does it mean to be a refugee. If somebody would come and tell me that I had to get out of my apartment and leave New York and I could take one small backpack with me, what would I put in my backpack? Would I buy a bar of gold or pieces of gold? Would I take my university diplomas? What would I take with me? Would I take a plastic bag and a pot for cooking? Would I take a bottle of water? Who knows where I'm going? And this is what really confronts the refugees of the past and of today. Here we see some of the pictures of the status of the Vietnamese refugees on these little islands, building homes, shacks, one almost on top of the other, of bamboo sticks, trying to survive. There's me with some of the refugees. On the right, you see the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital ship. At the bottom, there is the Île de Lumière, which was the one of the hospital ships that was taking care of the refugees. Well, today we are in a whole new migration situation. This is mass migration, convulsing the world. As the book by Kana on the right says, mass migration is reshaping the world. And what does that mean for you? Meaning people living in the rich countries. How is this mass migration in numbers we have never seen in the past? How is that going to shape our present and especially our future? Well, the United States reopened its doors to migration in 1965. That was the famous Hart-Celler Immigration Reform Act. The chart on the left shows the high point of immigration, 1901 to 1910. That was when all the Southern Italians and Eastern Europeans were coming over. The Orthodox Jews from Russia and Poland and Hungary, millions of Catholics from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Northern Yugoslavia. Huge migration, reaching over in that period of 10 years, over 8 million, possibly 9 million. Well, then during World War II, the United States slammed the doors of immigration closed. 31 to 40, very few people were coming in, which is one of the reasons why the Holocaust was so bloody, because the United States was no longer accepting refugees from Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Eastern Europeans fleeing the communists in Russia, and then the Nazis would get to a port, hoping to at least get on a boat to come to the United States, and they could not. And so they were forced to stay in Europe, and the United States bears a terrible burden for the Holocaust. Well, finally, in 65, the United States started opening up the gates of migration. We're now up to pushing 12 million a year. Declined under Donald Trump, who wanted to not only stop migration, but get rid of the ones who were here. But today, under President Biden, they are coming across the border by the hundreds of thousands. Well, the people who are coming in today were not like the immigrants of 1901, 1910. They were not Europeans. They were not white. They did not speak a European language. The ones who are coming in today, as you can see from the map, from the chart on the right, there are almost no Europeans coming in. The largest numbers are Mexicans, Cubans, people from the Philippines, people from China. Small number of Russians have come in recently, but the vast majority are Asians, people from India, from Pakistan, large numbers coming from Africa, especially English-speaking countries like Nigeria. And so the population of the United States is once again being swollen by millions of immigrants coming across the border, coming in from the airports, sneaking in from Canada any way they can to get into the United States now that the doors of immigration are open. Well, these immigrants are today coming for a variety of reasons. Warfare, places like Ethiopia, Somalia, former Yugoslavia, are fleeing war situations. Religious refugees, Jews coming from Russia and Eastern Europe, Muslims and Christians fleeing religious persecution in the Middle East. Economic, major cause of refugees and migrants fleeing poverty in Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Political refugees fleeing political oppression in Iran, or the crackdown on freedoms in Central America. Social, many women are fleeing the oppression of women in many Muslim countries. Racial, minorities are fleeing. Many African people of African origin from Central America and South America fleeing racism there. Muslims fleeing persecution in India. And ecological refugees. With global warming, Africa is becoming hotter and drier. People see their animals dying. They see that there's no future for them in half of the countries of Africa. They are fleeing and going to either Europe or to the United States or to some extent South America, because they see floods in Bangladesh, droughts in the Africa, and ecological refugees even within the United States. As the Southwest gets hotter and drier, many people are leaving. And so they go and find someplace else. So in the new mass migration is increasing rather than decreasing. And both the United States and Europe, the rich countries of the world, are being overwhelmed with millions of migrants. War is always a cause of migration. When the United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam, well, of course, it was going to cause millions of people to flee their homeland. When the puppet governments in Afghanistan and Vietnam and Cambodia collapsed, even more immigrants. Wars between ethnic groups in Africa, causing millions of Africans to flee. Wars in the Middle East, causing millions of Syrians, Iraqis, Lebanese, Palestinians to flee persecution, occupation in their own countries. So people fleeing wars. Today in Somalia, split with a war. The war in Sudan between the Christians and the Muslims. War in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Today, we have a mass migration from the Ukraine as Russia has invaded that country. So war is a major cause of mass migration today. Ecological migrants, global warming. We see the rising temperatures around the globe. Interestingly enough, the worst heating is going on in the North Pole, where the ice cap is melting. The ice of northern Canada, of Alaska, of Greenland, of Siberia, the ice caps are melting, leading to another problem, and that is the rising sea level. Well, at the same time, the global change is leading to massive floods in Asia, droughts in the American West and in Africa, where the land hasn't seen water in sometimes months. When I was in London in July of this year, they hadn't had rain in weeks. You'd go to the park, all the trees were losing their leaves in the middle of the summer. The grass was all dead, huge cracks in the parks where people would take a blanket to sit on, but they couldn't even get out of the sunshine because the leaves and the trees were almost all gone. The same thing in France, huge fires in the forests of southern France. Houses were being burned down in London because somebody would throw a cigarette out the window and it would set all the dead grass in their backyard on fire and the houses would go up in flames. Well, what do these people really have to look forward to on the right? You see in the right at the far end, you see a tractor and you see some buildings. How could you possibly plow this land and plant anything? So what do these people do? They get on a boat, they try to get to Europe, they cross from Africa to Mexico and try to sneak across the border, claiming refugee status or migrant status, fleeing global warming and hurricanes and floods in this planet, which is undergoing a major climatic change. The European migrant crisis, Angela Merkel at one point admitted 1 million new refugees into Germany. In fact, so many refugees are in London that they call it Londonistan. France is passing laws to try to limit the immigration from North Africa. People from the Middle East and North Africa crossing by boat to Italy or by land through Turkey into Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia. Europe is being swamped with new immigrants. In fact, many people say that the period of the present should be called the nomad century. Book by Gare Vince that talks about climate migration reshaping our world. Well, it is migration from not just climate change, but from many other factors as well. In the book on the right, Anatol Levin argues that the nation state, the country, is being so overwhelmed with immigrants that many people say that France is no longer a French country. It is becoming a multicultural country where entire sections of the cities are now populated by Arabic-speaking Muslims or Africans speaking their own various languages. In fact, when I was in Berlin not too long ago, there was a big article in the press where everybody was complaining that even the Germans, when they went to a restaurant in Berlin, the waiter would come up and inevitably ask them, would you like to order in English? Because so many of these new immigrants were taking over the job of waiters in restaurants that they never had the time or the interest to learn German. So was Germany becoming a bilingual country? Sweden, huge number of immigrants. And why should they learn Swedish? English or French or Spanish are more useful. Hungarians are doing everything they can to keep the refugees and the migrants out, even building walls like Donald Trump tried to do to stop this mass migration of peoples. Another major cause of migration is the rising sea levels. Just a week ago, we had a horrendous hurricane that ravaged Florida. Well, in the United States, it's a rich country, so people can get some of them will have insurance, others will get state and government handouts to rebuild their homes, even if they are in an area where they should not build. New Orleans is already below sea level, but yet the government has the money to rebuild the cities that are ravaged by hurricanes. Map on the right, you see all the red areas, all of Florida, the whole Atlantic coast way into Louisiana and up the Mississippi Valley. These are all flood-prone areas. New York, look at the light blue areas. These are all areas which in a hurricane will flood. Luckily, I live in Elmhurst on a hill, and so not far from Jackson Heights, which is luckily called a high area, and will be able to avoid any floods. But the United States and Europe are rich countries. We can build protection against rising sea. The bottom on the left, you see one of the big gates that are built by the Dutch and gradually are being built in places like Venice and Holland and the United States in some places because we have the money. But look at the map on the right, the three maps. If there is a sea level rise of 1.5 meters, 18 million people will find their homes flooded. Well, Bangladesh does not have the money to build giant sea gates and to rebuild every time there is a flood or a typhoon or a hurricane or something. They don't have the money. So what are these people doing? They are voting with their feet. They are becoming climate refugees, banging on the doors of England because most of them speak English, trying to sneak into the United States through an unguarded border with Canada or joining the refugees coming up from Mexico. So, major cause of refugees. When you consider that countries like India and Bangladesh and Indonesia have billions of people who can easily migrate. Another cause of climate change is, as you can see on the map on the bottom left, drought. While one area of the world is being plagued with flooding, other areas of the world, such as Southern Europe and the western half of the United States and Australia, are suffering from lack of water. California forest fires, Australian fires, fires in southern France and Spain, sweeping through the forests, taking out entire towns because of the drought. And they don't even have enough water for the fire trucks and the airplanes to put out these fires. Many times they just can't save a town or even a suburb. Well, in the United States, we have the money to rebuild. We have the money to fight forest fires, as do the French and the British and the Australians. But when you have a drought in a poor country such as India, in an entire section, the agriculture dies. In Africa, there's no grass for the animals to eat. Once again, these people vote with their feet. They gather what they can salvage. They cross Africa to the north, get on a boat and sail to Europe. Some of them go to ports and then get away to Mexico and then wait on the border trying to sneak through into the United States. Well, when I was in Paris on this past summer, scenes like this I saw in the upper left, demonstrations by new immigrants or refugees, many of them illegal refugees, demanding permission to stay in France. On the right and the bottom, streets of Paris lined with people living on the streets, waiting for a free meal, trying to find a place to live or a job. Boats, such as the one on the bottom on the left, when I took the ferry from France to Dover in England to visit London, we saw an abandoned boat where the people had obviously abandoned the boat and swam to shore, and the boat was drifting in the channel. Picture on the upper right shows the areas of the world that are drying out. Australia, only a few areas on the coast are green. The Sahara Desert in Africa, the deserts at the southern half of Africa, growing in size. Even South America, big area is becoming desert. Large parts of Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, the entire western half of the United States pushing up into Canada is drying out. The Middle East, which has always been dry, is getting even drier. Places like Mongolia, large parts of India, Pakistan, Kazakhstan in former Soviet Union are becoming drier. Well, what are the people going to do? In the United States, we have the money to rebuild. Australia has the money to rebuild. But in Africa, the Middle East, large parts of India, the money is not there. When your house is burned in a fire, you are left with nothing. Hopefully, the younger people will be able to manage a way to get to Europe or to get to the United States or another well-to-do country and survive. But the older people will very often remain behind and simply die. Another major cause is pollution. I remember when I lived in Czechoslovakia back in the early 70s, the factories of the border area, the Sudeten area between Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia, used coal in all of its factories. That picture on the right is what I would breathe every day. Below that, you see a picture of New Delhi in India. When I was in China, in Shanghai and in Beijing, I'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning so that I could get somewhere. As soon as the sun came up, I would snap all of my pictures because I knew by 9 o'clock in the morning, the sky would be as polluted as it is in these pictures. And this is a disease-causing factor. Asthma, lung diseases, a weakening of the lungs. I remember when I was in Czechoslovakia, we would watch television with our eyes closed because the air was so polluted that you took every opportunity you could to close your eyes. People would be sitting on a park bench with their eyes closed and very often wearing a mask against pollution long before the mask became associated with COVID. So the situation is causing many people to flee. Diseases. A lot of these poor countries don't have the medical infrastructure to treat these diseases. Young people will say, well, the jobs are bad. They're going to kill me by the time I'm 30. Another reason to flee their countries. Well, we understand now why all these people are on the move. Well, they are going, unfortunately, to places where there is money, there are jobs, the air might be a little bit cleaner, countries that can deal with global warming to a certain extent, the rise of sea level, they're transitioning to electric energy. But yet these people have conflicting attitudes towards all of these migrants and refugees. Well, Thomas Friedman, a journalist at the New York Times, wrote a fascinating book called The World is Flat, a brief history of the 21st century. And his argument is that the borders between countries are gradually disappearing. For example, no matter where I'm traveling, I can see CNN on television. I can listen to BBC, France 24, Chinese television, Al Jazeera. These are global news outlets that you can get anywhere. They don't stop at a border. Even if countries like Russia and China and Iran try to block the news or heavily censor it, people can still find some way to access international news. Money flows across the borders with no resistance. You're going to build a big new factory in India? Well, you raise money on the stock market in New York or Shanghai or Frankfurt or Paris or London. Technology. You can have somebody on a camel going through a desert region in Africa, and suddenly his cell phone rings and he talks to his cousin in New York, his brother, who is an illegal immigrant in London, or his mother, who is back at the grass hut in their little village. So everything passes borders. Pollution from a factory in Chicago can blow north and pollute the air of Canada. And migrations don't stop at the border. Boats going across the Mediterranean, dumping hundreds of thousands of migrants in Europe. Hundreds of thousands lined up trying to sneak across the border from Mexico. So Europe, the United States, Australia, and the other rich countries of the world are the ones who are attracting all of these migrants. And the reactions in these countries are very complex. We just saw not too long ago Donald Trump trying to stamp out immigrants from Africa, immigrants from South America, wanting to make America white again. People like Stephen K. Bannon, books like The Camp of the Saints by Jean Raspail argue that the United States, France, Germany, Sweden, England, Italy, Spain are being overrun with refugees, with immigrants, and they are going to destroy these countries. In the United States, the bigger debate is, are we still a melting pot nation, or do these immigrants have no intention of becoming Americans? They build their Hebrew language, Arabic language schools. They try to avoid becoming American. Many of them have 2 and 3 passports. They send their children back on vacation to Dominican Republic, to Mexico, to make sure that they remain Spanish speaking. Well, many people argue that Israel Zangwill's theory of American melting pot is no longer working, that all of these new migrants coming in are insistent on remaining separate. This is what we call the salad bowl, where every city will have its Haitian neighborhood, its Jewish neighborhood, its Muslim neighborhood, its Nigerian neighborhood, and they have no intention of becoming Americans. Many of the Jews have 2 and 3 passports. are equally happy in Tel Aviv or Buenos Aires or New York City. The Americans are developing a theory of multiculturalism, which is viciously opposed by the Republicans, who argue melt, assimilate, become an American, or get out. Samuel P. Huntington's book, Who Are We?, called the threat of mass migration one of the greatest dangers to the United States, that we will cease to exist as a white Christian country. Here again, that's Donald Trump's argument. Stop Jewish, stop Muslim, stop Chinese, stop Hindu, stop a Mexican immigration. Go back to the wonderful years before 1965. And don't forget, Donald Trump is a boy from Queens. And Queens, where I live in New York, is probably the most diverse area in the world. And so when he saw his nice white Christian Queens being overrun by Indians and Africans and Arabs and Central Asian Jews, he rose in revolt. Make America great again means get rid of all of these people. Time to take back America. We have far distanced ourselves from the Christian God, and we have lost our identity. So Donald Trump and Samuel P. Huntington, the late Samuel P. Huntington, my old professor from Harvard, would agree that the very character of the United States is being endangered by this mass migration. Build that wall. So many people in the Republican Party agreed that it is time to stop migration and not just build a wall between Mexico and the United States, but go into the cities of the North and the West, round up illegal immigrants, round up Muslims, and expel them. Stop the Chinese migration, the Indian migration, the African migration. Make America white again. Well, this sentiment is not just in the United States, but also in Europe. The bottom on the left, you see the subway station, Jaurès, right where I stay when I'm in Paris on the Rue Menardier. This is what I saw every time I would walk by the subway station. Thousands of immigrants, migrants living in tents. Half of them don't even speak French. They're trying to get to Britain, which is English speaking, but they are stranded in France. Well, of course, the French are as up in anger as much as Donald Trump was, seeing his queens overrun with immigrants and migrants. Well, the same thing is happening in France. In Germany, we see the political party Alternative für Deutschland. Damit aus Europa kein Orobin wird. We are opposed to Europe becoming a non-European state. Below that, expulsion des islamistes, expelling what they believe to be radical Islamists, which in France, almost every Muslim is considered a radical. In the United States, Donald Trump argued that the Mexicans coming over were rapists, and so they should be stopped from coming to the United States. Poland, interestingly, huge migrant population from Poland all across Europe, London, France, everywhere, taking advantage of the membership of Poland in the European Union. Even these white Christian migrants to England caused a horrendous reaction in London, saying we have all of these Africans, Pakistanis, Indians, Bangladesh, people coming from the Middle East flooding into England. And now we're being overrun by hundreds of thousands of Polish immigrants. So I saw when I was in London, I saw signs such as leave the European Union. This was called Brexit. No more Polish vermin, no more Polish rats. And so England became very anti-immigrant. In fact, that's one of the main reasons they left the European Union. And they talk about London's Polish borders, meaning is London becoming more and more Polish or Indian or Pakistani? Well, when I was in London, thank God for Pakistani and Indian restaurants because English food is terrible. So I was thrilled to go to their restaurants. So around the world, the rich world, there is a vicious reaction against what many people call the other, people different from them. Brexit stopped immigration from Europe and from the world. The Front National in France calling for a renaissance of France, which means basically get rid of the foreigners. Even in India, returning to Hinduism, get rid of Muslims, Jains, Sikhs, Christians, and Jews, make India Hindu again. Donald Trump, make America great again. Alternative for Deutschland, make Germany German again. Netanyahu in Israel, with his vicious suppression, persecution of the Muslims and Christians, make Israel Jewish. We don't need migrants. We don't need minorities. So we see this vicious, many people call it racism or religious prejudice or hatred, the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and America. Make America Christian again. This is a global reaction against minorities and against migrants, and even a reaction against refugees. This is not a dumping ground. And the United States has a long history of both accepting immigrants, such as we did after 1965, and as we did 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the 1880s, 1890s, and the early 100s. The United States accepted millions of immigrants. But yet we had a reaction against the Asians, the 1880s, the Chinese Exclusion Act. There was a reaction during World War II against the Jews, saying, get out of the United States. This is a Christian country. Go to Israel. So the United States has a mixed history as far as immigrants, at times accepting them with open arms, as many as it could come in, and then at other times slamming the door shut. Well, this reaction takes many forms. Desecration of Jewish cemeteries, saying we have enough Jews, get out of France and England and Germany and the United States. getting rid of the dirty ragheads, get rid of Muslims. We have the English Defense League become English speaking, no bilingual schools. England is not a dumping ground for immigrants and refugees. Well, on that positive note, we can look even further into the future. How many people will this planet Earth be able to support if global warming continues, if wars break out between countries in Africa and Asia, fighting over water rights, a limited amount of land? How will these threats of the future affect us? Well, we just saw recently with the COVID pandemic that the United States was definitely not open and welcoming. We hoarded the vaccines. We gave very little vaccine to other countries. So when push comes to shove and there's not enough land and water to go around, the United States is going to slam even further shut its doors to keep out immigrants. Well, the one alternative is to start building colonies in space or colonies on other planets. Is the next big wave of human migration going to be to space? We're already exploring the possibilities of moon bases. We're looking for what they call Goldilocks planets. Those are planets which have similar conditions as Earth to start building other colonies. Well, this is going to cause a lot of problems too. Is one colony going to be English speaking and American and keep out blacks and Jews and Asians? Are the Chinese going to build a colony to siphon off some of its excess population? Will these colonies have the same race wars as we are having today in the United States? But I firmly believe that the next stop is going to be space, the next big migration of humanity. Well, a lot of sci-fi movies are exploring this possibility. Amazing Stories, very old sci-fi magazine, has always been fascinated by space exploration and space colonies. The Martian Chronicles, going into great detail in what our civilizations on other planets will be like. The science futurism, life on a space colony, imagining what's it going to be like. Wonderful movie, Elysium, with Matt Damon and Jodie Foster, talking about space colonies again, and the conflict between the space colonies and those left behind. Are the Americans going to build space colonies and let the Africans and the Asians die of starvation, drought, earthquakes, and other atmospheric changes? Are we going to protect our kind and let the rest of the world die of pandemics, poverty, disease? National Geographic series on exploring Mars, even coming up with cities underground in big domes. Maclean's magazine, The Space Issue, Our Next Home. Going to the moon, building colonies, and then from the moon, moving on to our next colony. Well, on the topic of migrations, maybe it will be other planets which will run out of resources, or the planet will be degraded to such an extent that they themselves will be forced to move to other planets. So here we have movies like Aliens. Well, we always portray in movies aliens as being nasty, evil creatures out to take over our resources. Here again, how will we react when we are confronted with migrations of millions of aliens, of Martians, showing up one day in Central Park demanding water, food, and a place to build their ethnic neighborhoods? Very often when I give walking tours of the Lower East Side of Manhattan, I chronicle the history of the neighborhood, beginning as an English and Scottish dumping ground for the poor who were coming from Europe, followed by the Irish and German mass migration to the Lower East Side. Then by the 1880s, it was Eastern European Jews coming over and living in poverty in the Lower East Side. Today, it is Hispanics and Chinese who are taking over everything. And I always conclude my visit by telling my students, well, probably the next time I give this talk, there will be aliens living in the Lower East Side. It will be their ethnic neighborhood. And once again, are they going to intermarry with humans? What would a half alien baby and a half human baby look like? Will they learn English? Will they assimilate into the melting pot? Or will they remain a foreign element carved into the heart of New York City? So migration is not over. It is here, and it is going to determine our future. So that brings us to an end of this exploration of this fascinating topic. If you have anything you'd like to share with me, please feel free to send something to ronbrownmedia@gmail.com. There you see me climbing up the pyramids of Egypt. And once again, experiencing the reality of global migration, whether it's among the Vietnamese refugees in South Pacific, whether it is teaching in New York, where half of my students are born in other countries, or whether it is in Egypt, a country with a booming population, very little land, and only one river to keep an entire civilization alive. No wonder Egyptians are migrating by the millions to Arabia, the Persian Gulf, Europe, and the United States. So migrations have been a major factor in not just American history, but global history. We tend to think of the United States as an immigrant country. Unfortunately, today, every country is an immigrant country. This is a global phenomenon that the world must get involved in. So this is Dr. Ronald J. Brown signing off. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you in the future.